Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, it was another milestone-y sort of weekend for me. I didn't do any podcasts, but I did run a half marathon on Sunday, even though I'd never run a race longer than 5K before this, which is exactly 10 miles shorter. It came about kind of impulsively. I was on the train to D.C. on Friday for a meeting about drug shortages and national security, because that's my day gig. And I was looking up the race that my pals in our running group were doing on Sunday. And it was a 12K in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And I was thinking maybe I should start extending the length of my races so that I can build up to my goal of running a marathon before my 50th birthday in 2021. The thing was, when the list of weekend races in New Jersey came up, I noticed a Sunday half marathon in Paramus, about 25 minutes from my house. And I kind of hemmed and hawed about it, because while I have run that distance with my running group, we did it at a kind of slow pace with a couple of short walking breaks every 2 or 3 miles. So I zapped 2 of my pals in the group, asked them, based on the amount of running they've seen me do, whether they thought it was feasible for me to run a half, and they wrote back that I'd have a great time. They were confident I'd do fine based on the 5 and 7 and 11 mile runs that we do every week. So during the train ride home, I signed up. It was only a 45-minute meeting in Washington, which may seem like a waste of travel time, but I find face-to-face conversation a lot better than the missed cues of a phone call or a Skype or something like that. So much like the podcast. So then I spent Saturday worrying about my water intake, trying not to eat anything that might cause gastric distress or otherwise be a problem on Sunday's race. And then Sunday rolled around. I had a banana, a dried fig, some water, and I ran 13.1 miles. My goals for the race, in descending order, were survive, don't be incontinent, break the 2-hour mark, break the 152 mark, and try to be in the top 100. I came in at 149.50. I am still alive. I did not pee or poop myself. I only came in at 104 out of 370 runners, so I still feel like something of a disappointment to myself, even though this was so much better than I could have imagined for my first half marathon. Frankly, I'm amazed that I could mentally keep focus on something like this for almost 2 hours without just breaking into a walk or quitting or finding some way of defeating myself. This is not something I would have been capable of 6 months ago. So all thanks go to my running group for kind of getting me in this long distance approach, because prior to that I was just doing 2 to 3 miles and burning myself out, and they really helped me learn how to just keep going, which is what I did. Now, if I could just translate that focus into writing, I'd be all set. Instead, you get this podcast, which is the other model of focus and stability in my life. Now, this week's guest is Dawn Raffel, and she's the author of a wonderful book, The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney, How a Mysterious European Showman Saved Thousands of American Babies. It came out last year from Blue Rider Press, and it's out this week in paperback. So Dawn's book is about Martin Cooney, the guy who popularized the use of incubators to save premature babies. The thing was, he did this not in hospitals necessarily, but by showing the babies off at sideshow attractions in Coney Island and Atlantic City and Chicago and elsewhere during the first half of the 20th century. See, at the time, there weren't a lot of options for preemies, and in fact, there was actually some debate as to whether it made sense to even try to keep them alive, which is a very it's a very difficult subject and one that the Dawn goes into in the book and in our conversation. So Dr. Cooney was definitely a pioneer in a lot of ways, and also a mysterious European showman. See, the thing is, as Dawn researched the facts and the mythology of Cooney's life, she realized there were a lot of questions about his background, some of which had implications into how his whole incubator operation worked, and why the medical establishment was resistant to his ideas. And even that, regardless of his reputation, goes to show how entrenched fields like the medical establishment will try to keep out change. This is the way we do things. We're not going to change, especially if some outsider tells us that they've got a better idea. So the book is kind of illuminating in that, along with just the overall story of Dr. Cooney and of Dawn's research plays a role in how the story gets told. All around, The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney is an amazing combination of research and storytelling, because she really brings Cooney's era to life, especially the glory days of the boardwalks. But also, she asks tough questions about the life that he lived and the era that he lived in. The book it's also this wonderful tribute to the children Cooney saved through his innovative treatment, a bunch of whom make a contemporary appearance in the book itself. So The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney by Dawn Raffel, out in paperback this week. Go pick it up. Now, as caveats go, Dawn's dog, Pierre, wanted to get some book recommendations in near the end of the episode. At least, I think that's what he was barking about. I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, he'll make his appearance near the end of the show. The other caveat I just want to throw out there, I'm the exact opposite of a preemie. I was born 15 days late. I took 24 hours for delivery, and I showed up 24 inches tall and 10 pounds, 6 ounces, all of which my mother has never forgiven me for. Now, here's Dawn's bio. There's a longer version in the show notes page for this episode, as well as her website. Dawn Raffel is a journalist, memoirist, and short story writer whose work has been widely anthologized. A longtime magazine editor, she helped launch O, the Oprah magazine. She has also taught creative writing in the MFA program at Columbia University, at summer literary seminars in St. Petersburg, Russia, Montreal, and Vilnius, Lithuania, and Tbilisi, Georgia, and at the Center for Fiction in New York. She now works as an independent editor and book reviewer. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Dawn Raffel. One of the things I usually ask a guest, especially with a nonfiction book, was what was the origin of the book? But in this case, the origin is something that's incorporated and integrated into the book itself, along with the research. So can you talk a little about the origin and then that decision to bring it into the whole process of the narrative itself?
Yeah, I was originally fascinated by the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago in 1933 and 34. I was doing some research about it, and I saw this picture of this giant exhibit right smack in the middle of the midway that said living babies in incubators. And I'm thinking, what the heck is that? And I happened to be out at the Coney Island Museum with a friend. When I say I happened to be there, that means I dragged her because I love this kind of thing. And there it was again. It was the incubators, and it was the same guy. And it turned out that this was on Coney Island for 40 years and Atlantic City for 40 years. And so at that point, I thought, that just does it. I need to get to the bottom of this story. I had no idea what kind of rabbit hole of research I was about to try to go down.
And that decision to make it part of the book itself, to bring yourself into the narrative, I suppose.
I brought myself into the narrative because I also wanted to bring into the narrative the other people who tried to get to the bottom of this story. Mm-hmm. There was a whole group of doctors starting in the 1950s who called themselves the Cooney buffs, and they were trying to untangle the mystery of who this guy was. His deceptions were so elaborate that it really took their research at a time when some of the people involved with the story, more of the people involved with the story, were still alive. And then my pounding the pavement in New York, and also the fact that I have the benefit of the internet so I can find where different things are archived. So I really wanted to show the reader this whole process of how the history of something like this is uncovered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you mentioned deceptions, at least from the way that the book is, it doesn't seem as though it was done with malicious intent by any means.
I don't think any of it was malicious at all. I think he did what he felt he had to do. And I think increasingly over time, he kind of painted himself into a corner where if he wanted to stay in business, it's not too big a spoiler to say he was never a real doctor. But he increasingly embellished his credentials as time moved forward, and the people who could have proved him wrong were no longer living.
Yeah. And throughout the book, there are those instances where they have to bring in a young graduate of medical school basically to certify, various aspects of the incubator process, the nurseries, I guess, because he's not actually
right. So he never did anything illegal because he never signed a death certificate or anything like that. He would get one of his, his assistant to do the paperwork for him, which seemed perfectly legitimate.
Now, when you say you dragged your friend to the Coney Island Museum because that's one of your things, what exactly is that thing? Is it the museum thing or the sideshow thing?
I'm just fascinated by Coney Island, the whole thing, the boardwalk, the sideshows. I'm working on something now that involves that as well. I'm just intrigued by it.
Mm-hmm. You're actually the third guest this year who has a sideshow-oriented book. I had Bill Griffith, who did a graphic biography of Schlitzie the Pinhead. And coming up in October, I already recorded with her. Liz Hand has a book about Henry Darger and the Chicago, not the World's Fair, but the Chicago, I guess it is that second World's Fair, the one in the 20s into the 30s, where Dr. Cooney gets alluded to in her book. So I thought, wow, everything's sort of weirdly tying together for my guess, and everybody's got some sort of sideshow interest and attraction. But talking about Dr. Cooney, did you have any background in con men or shady European characters before this?
None.
Okay.
No.
And to that extent, was there a degree of disbelief in terms of he wouldn't possibly, say this about himself if this wasn't true? Or did you just take everything as, if he says it, I better go verify it?
It wasn't so much that, but when I started doing the research, everything that was previously published about Dr. Cooney, which meant many newspaper and magazine articles during his lifetime and then references to him in peer-reviewed medical publications, had this same biography about his very fancy European medical training and how he came over here. But when I would follow any of the footnotes back to the source was Dr. Cooney himself. And I just started to think, it doesn't make sense. I don't understand this. So, right, he came to the United States for the Omaha World's Fair and was seized with the desire to relocate across an ocean. Why? Once you've seen Omaha, you can never return to Paris. Like, why would you do that? Why would you spend the rest of your life on the Midway? Why would you never publish anything in a peer-reviewed journal? And so that's when I started poking around and thinking, well, okay, so where's his immigration? Where's his naturalization? When did he come over here? What was his real name? I was pretty sure it wasn't Cooney because that's a name that just doesn't make sense in any language.
Mm-hmm. And that degree of, you mentioned having the internet at your disposal helps, but you also seem to run up to the limits of the world that isn't digitized.
Absolutely.
The non-Googleable world.
Absolutely. We kind of think we can get anything with a couple clicks of the mouse, and we can't. A lot of things were not digitized and held in archives. I did a lot of pavement pounding to find things that were just in sometimes handwritten records that were hard to read. And also, I really wanted to find Dr. Cooney's patients who were still living. And there are quite a few of them still alive.
To me, the core of the book, or the heart of it.
The heart of it is those people, and more of them came forward after the book was published. I found more of them.
That's what I was wondering. Did anything come out, since the paperback's about to come out, which is why we're doing this episode, from the time the hardcover came out, did any facts or other things come up that you thought, oh my God, I wish I knew that when I was doing the book? Or was it more just... it was more just that there were more people who came forward, and either it was they were one of Dr. Cooney's patients or their parent was one of Dr. Cooney's patients. The single document you wish you could have found? I mean, I know we had the logbook. Is that the...
That's really it. He apparently did have a log of all of his patients at some point, and I went through everything. I was looking through the probate file of the will of anybody who was connected with him, the nurse, his daughter, his wife, to see where that might have gone, because there was an accounting of all of the property down to the jewelry, but there was no mention of that book, and I'm assuming somebody just threw it out.
Is this the most in-depth research you've done for a writing project?
Oh, this is far and away the most in-depth research I've done. I was previously, I had many, many years of working for magazines, and I did many magazine profiles, but this was a very different order of research. And it was interesting because it was sort of a mix of archival and reported work, where I felt like this was a story that was really right on the verge of being lost, because the last people who had met Dr. Cooney or could say anything about it won't be here that much longer. The woman whose story opens the book has already passed away.
You have the note at the very end. To that extent, did you feel you were racing against time?
I did feel I was racing against time, And if somebody in their 90s was agreed to an interview, I was sort of like, okay, let's do it right now.
I can get over there right here. And to be honest, that's part of my thing with this. I've had guests who were mid-90s, and I'm like, we can do this weekend. That's fine. But what was it like, though, finding the shape of this book? Because you've got... in addition to bringing your own story and the story of the survivors into it, it also has I don't want to say a flashback, but a different structure in terms of time and how it's put together. It
has a really unusual shape. I went through many drafts of this book, and I know there are people who are really committed to chronological order. I felt like writing this in strict chronological order became very samey. There was this fair, and then there was that fair, and then there was another fair. And I really wanted to give more of a kaleidoscopic view of what was going on with him. And then, so really one thread is pretty much his story that does move forward in time, and it's interspersed with another narrative, which is the discovery of who he really was and who his patients were.
And the book itself started as fiction?
No, it didn't start as fiction.
I wasn't sure if that was a attempt on your part to if you tried doing it in that form or not.
No, I didn't. I felt like the most interesting thing about this story is that it's the truth.
Yeah, it seems stranger than fiction,
It is stranger than fiction. It's so odd. And this could never happen now. And yet it's really interesting because he offered free medical care also to people who desperately needed it. And you don't now have a Dr. Cooney if you don't have insurance. And nobody had insurance at that time.
Was there a point at which you wondered what you would have done if you had a premature child back in that era? Would you have put it in a sideshow incubator?
You're the first person to ask me that, but probably I would. So during one of my talks, there was a gentleman in the audience, and he was born prematurely right toward the end of Dr. Cooney's run. And his parents at that point had a choice because the hospital did have an incubator. And they told him essentially they could pay to keep him in the hospital, which was going to cost a fortune, or they could send him to Coney Island where he'd be cared for free. And his parents did what you would think any really conscientious parents would do, which is they scraped and they paid for him to stay in the hospital. He is visually impaired, and he probably would have been fully sighted if they had sent him to the sideshow.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting part where you showed how the the different protocols of treatment, in fact, turned out to be better on
the protocol in the sideshow, who knew, was actually better. And Dr. Cooney himself did not understand it. But there was a period of time when premature infants treated in hospitals were losing their eyesight because there was too much oxygen in the incubators. Cooney happened to have not as deep a saturation, and because he was a showman and they would take the babies out of the incubator and show them off, they didn't get enough oxygen to damage their vision.
And I think you mentioned Stevie Wonder was potentially, that may be
from what I've read, that was the cause. Yeah. I haven't asked him, but
yeah. But you can get him on the show.
Yeah.
But to that extent, if you'd had a premature kid, you would have felt I know I'm putting you on the spot, but
yeah. I mean, I would have felt like I would do whatever I had to do to try to save my child.
Yeah.
You know, and in most cases at that time, until the very end, the hospitals weren't really even offering a choice. They were saying, your only chance is this sideshow. So as I said, like in the book, there was also another instance of a woman where she and her twin were born premature. The mother's roommate in the hospital also had premature twins, and the doctor came in and said to both mothers, your only hope here is to send your children to Coney Island. And the other mother said, absolutely not. I'm not putting my children in a sideshow. And those two children didn't live.
And you have the one with the one twin who dies, and the doctor just telling them to get ready for the second one. There's no point in burying the first, and instead they go off to the sideshow. Was there ever a feeling that you'd sort of captured Cooney? That you got his spirit, or does he remain an enigma to you?
A little of both. I feel like he's still somewhat enigmatic. I'm sure he probably still has some additional secrets up his elegant sleeve. He was very hard to pin down.
Did you have either a contemporary or some other comparator for him? Is there anyone you would say he was a lot like this figure?
I don't think he's like anybody I've ever encountered, which is why I was so fascinated by him.
Yeah, I was wondering, because it's such an absolutely odd
It's odd,
set of circumstances.
And it's very complicated. I can only guess at his motives, but I think that he genuinely cared for these children. Yeah. I think that he got into doing this possibly at the very beginning because it seemed like a clever way to show a new technology and make some money while you were doing it. But I also think he understood that nobody else was going to save these children if he didn't. He kept trying and trying and trying to persuade doctors, and he kept trying to donate equipment. He tried after the San Francisco World's Fair, which closed at the end of 1915. And, it was like they didn't even want the equipment. In New York, as late as 1940, when the New York World's Fair closed, the city of New York did not want his life-saving equipment. Chicago ended up taking it.
Mm-hmm. And it never seems, at least you never represent him as a hustle. There's never a sense that, ultimately there was not a scam, but at least, it seems even when he was making money that he was still very giving about who he was. That this wasn't
I think he was very giving. I mean, I don't think he saw a conflict between altruism and his own self-interest. I think he very much enjoyed the fact that he made a lot of money and he was getting rich. But you could probably say the same thing about a very successful doctor before managed care. I think he thoroughly enjoyed being a showman. He was really the front person. He liked being out on the midway. He loved talking to people. There were kind of rumors about him that nobody was ever able to prove anything. I mean, one rumor was he ever taking kickbacks from doctors to give him the babies, and nobody found anything to support that one. And the other question was, did he secretly broker adoptions? Yeah. And that one, I don't know. I have to say, I was never able to find any evidence of it, but there probably wouldn't have been any evidence of it.
And that's also, from our jaded perspective, you can look back and even if something like that did occur, you could sort of justify it?
I can sort of justify it because the alternative is some of these children who ended up in the sideshow were either orphaned or their parents abandoned them.
Yeah.
So if this is a child that was now going to end up in an orphanage, not so great to begin with, but really not so great if it's now a 5-pound baby that needs special care, that's a terrible situation, as opposed to if it will be adopted into a loving family. So again, he made sure to take care of his own financial interests. But if he did that, was it really so bad?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. It seems you can justify, I don't mean rationalize. Yeah. I mean, you can really justify that in terms of, be a lot better for the baby himself. Or, baby
it is
itself.
Better for the baby. Yeah.
Now, but it is it's an alien time when, like you mentioned, managed care isn't there, Social Security, all these other things that we have that sort of create a different network where something like this wouldn't necessarily exist. Eugenics were also, a big issue. Wrapping your brain around some of the pre-World War II mentalities in America as you're relating the story, how difficult was that? How much of an alien territory did it seem?
I was horrified by it, and that was something I was not expecting to find, because even when I looked at medical histories of the history of neonatology, there is an acknowledgement that there was a period where this kind of care really was missing. It fell through the cracks. And one issue was also there was a little turf war between obstetrics and pediatrics, where there was just sort of preemie was sort of in nowhere land. But they didn't really mention that the whole thing is surrounded by this culture of eugenics. And I felt like, well, this environment where the medical term for preemie is weakling, and the medical term for a baby that is full term but underweight is feeble. It's that mindset. And you have contests going on at state fairs for, eugenic contests for the best baby. That wasn't really a beauty contest. It was done by eugenic measures. It has to factor in. They weren't specifically targeting preemies, but there also wasn't that big of an interest in doing something for them. So it wasn't just Dr. Cooney saying this. When I looked at Dr. Cooney's very, very credentialed supporter, Dr. Julius Hess, who was a real doctor and who was pretty much considered the father of clinical American neonatology, Dr. Hess's head nurse in some of her writings wrote, even later in the 30s, about their frustration with the fact that people just did not think these babies were worth saving.
Yeah, that sense that the weak are going to pollute the gene pool.
It was that, or there'll be a drain on society. They won't be productive citizens. It was just sort of just let that go.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was when I mentioned the other Sideshow-related guests, Bill Griffith's piece about Schlitzie the Pinhead. Parents apparently sold him at the age of 9 or 10 to the Sideshow. And while Bill, as his biographer, feels kind of bad for the parents, there's also the sense that this is the 1910s. This kid would have grown up and needed, it would have been feeble-minded, as it were, and would have needed care his entire life. And at least on the Sideshow, he was getting paid. He was being taken care of by the other freaks, as the term was back then. But yeah, that's
in some cases, world. Yeah, it was a better life, because they would otherwise, many of them have been essentially incarcerated in institutions. Yeah. And so having the life of being in the Sideshow was a better deal than that.
And were there other aspects of pre-World War II culture that were tough to wrap your brain around, or just kind of alien to where we were?
It was mostly that. With as I said, I wasn't really expecting to see the eugenic component of this, where there's a very popular movie called The Black Stork, which was advocating proactively, withholding care for severely disabled infants. But it's also, I feel like the ethical questions about who decides who gets to live are as relevant now. So now we have questions that are about, what kind of end-of-life decisions do we make? What kind of decisions do we make if a child is born really, really premature?
Or genetic testing.
Genetic testing. Not only genetic testing, but genetic editing. Yeah. It just, the questions and the possibilities for abuse become more intense.
Mm-hmm. What did you learn about yourself in the process of writing this book?
What did I learn about myself?
You bring yourself in as a character. I figure it's fair to ask.
I know. I reconfirmed my notion of just how stubborn I can be when I'm trying to figure something out.
Yeah.
I just felt really dogged about trying to get to the bottom of this to the extent that I could.
Yeah, was there a point of losing heart, and just that the document isn't there that I need to find, or did you always feel?
Sometimes I felt really frustrated where I could spend so much time and come up with nothing. One of which was I really wanted to find a record of his birth, and they just didn't have birth records in that part of Europe at that time. It wasn't there. I couldn't find out any more about his parents than their names. And it really, I would have to say it was the babies, shall we call them, themselves who kept me going at a certain point. I had an advance also, but beyond that, some of the women whose stories are in the book, they kept calling and emailing me saying, when's the book coming out? How's it going? How's it coming? And I felt like, all right, I have to just, because there was a certain point where I felt like I'm not going to be able to get to the bottom of this story.
Yeah, were there any late documents that you had to revise in terms of writing? Things you had written that turned out that, oh, wait a second, this contradicts something I've already written. Later research, I mean.
No, by the time I was doing the writing, I had most of the basic research. For me, it was just the really feeling confident in the idea that he really was not a doctor. It's very hard to prove a negative. So it was putting together everything from, I'm looking at his immigration. I'm looking at there's no record of his matriculating anywhere. I'm looking at no medical license on file anywhere. And again, I also went over this with Dr. Gartner, who's a neonatologist who's quoted in the book, who spent some time studying Dr. Cooney. Let's look at all the facts. Do either of us think he could possibly have been an MD? No. Mm-hmm. And he also very, very generously read the book so he could tell me what I got wrong about neonatology, too. I just wanted to make sure because I'm not a doctor myself.
Yeah, how much of an education was that for you?
It was an education. I had to read a fair number of medical books, and I interviewed several doctors, and I went and I looked at, the neonatal ICU as it is now. I had to ask a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. Was Cooney held in, I know from the 50s into the 70s, you've got that sort of Cooney society of guys. Has he faded among the neonatologists, or is it still one of those, where he's sort of regarded as a kind of mythic hero?
I think people are fascinated by him, and I think they're probably more willing to give him credit now than they were then. He was such an outsider that when you would read a medical history that was published in the mid 20th century, 1970s or so, even a little later, he was viewed as sort of an oddity, but I think he's given more credit now for what he's done. I am going to a convention of neonatologists in December who are fascinated by this. I also heard from a neonatologist in Illinois, and he is looking at the fact that at some point in the late 50s, the United States Bureau of Children's Health sent a video to hospitals in small towns throughout the country that showed a protocol for taking care of preemies. And he is actually convinced that it was based on Dr. Cooney's show, trying to show that link. So I think there's also just more of an awareness of just how heavily influential he was. Also that I discovered that he seems to have met Dr. Julius Hess much earlier in Dr. Hess's career, and was really a heavy influence on him as well. So I think the case is, I think honestly he is the rightful father of American neonatology. He's just an unusual one.
Yeah. And had the era interested you prior to this?
The era is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
The era is absolutely fascinating to me. It does. I mean, this book really spans from before the First World War up to the Second World War. But there was, especially the 30s to me, the early 30s seemed like an inflection point where so many things were changing and so many things could have gone one way or another.
Is that reflect? I'm going to feel like a heel because I haven't read your fiction or your memoir. In fact, what am I missing by not having done that before we sat down? Is that,
I don't feel like you need to have read that to read this book.
Yeah.
I tend not to write in chronological order, so you'll see that theme reflected.
Good. And just making sure.
Yeah.
Actually, that balance for you between fiction and nonfiction, is that a time and place? This is a story versus this is a piece of nonfiction, either an article or a book. Well, I guess, what do you like writing more?
I like both of them. It really depends, like what the story is. And to me, this was a story where I drove myself insane to check facts and double check facts and re-fact check. And it's impossible to get it 100%. I'm sure that somewhere in there I missed something, or that, we also tend to think if something is in a book, it's more accurate than something that you read online when you're doing research. Sure. But books have mistakes in them too. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, my wife is on a Facebook thread that she just started in a romance readers forum about whether factual errors can be so bad that they derail you from enjoying the novel. And she's just had this thread of hundreds of other people writing in, talking about awful experiences they've had and why it's gotten them off of that stuff. I know that's fiction versus trusting nonfiction.
I went through I spent an entire month on those endnotes, which are sort of narrative if you read through them.
Oh, yeah.
There's more than 600 of them. But it was really like something as just a very small thing that happens in the book was the infamous execution of the elephant on Coney Island.
Autopsy.
It's horrifying. But when I went to find out, what's the real story, because the myth is that it was Thomas Edison, which turns out, no, it wasn't really Thomas Edison. He supplied the electricity. The showman provided the motive. But I thought, okay, well, I'll just get newspapers that were published that day. It was front page news everywhere. And in New York, you had a lot of daily newspapers. And so I was lining up multiple newspapers from that day, and they all said something kind of different. Mm-hmm. So at a certain point, you can drive yourself crazy trying to get to the bottom of it. I ended up using a composite, and in the end note, just saying that it was based on these newspapers.
It was a mini David Foster Wallace thing with the extensive endnotes, but again, to an actual good purpose, as opposed to infinite jest, where it just kind of...
Oh, yeah. No, I really felt like also if you really are interested in neonatology or other aspects of this, here's where you can go. Yeah.
And again, just the book itself, within the main book, it's... the research of the book is part of the story. So, I think... I
became kind of compulsive about the research.
Yes, you should.
But there was an unbelievably wonderful production person at Penguin. Mm-hmm. And I was just trying to be clever and use, neonatology language. So I described the doctor as lifting that phone out of its cradle. And she was like, no, not that year, because the phone wouldn't have had a cradle until 4 years later. And I was like, could I have some license? And she was like, no.
More to the point, contemporary readers aren't going to know what a phone coming out of a cradle is.
That's true also.
And we're dating ourselves when we say that.
I forgot about certain things where it's like, okay, people don't know what that is.
Yeah. Well, apparently there's an 80s-based TV show on Netflix where there was a scene of people developing film. And younger people have no idea why there's a room with a red light in it and people coming out with pictures, because that's obsolete technology. It's a Jurassic World, I guess. Veering away from the book a little bit, you just got back from Tbilisi?
I did, yeah.
Where you were teaching.
Yes.
Can you talk a little about that program and teaching in general? And I'll ask a whole bunch of questions about teaching. But,
sure. I love teaching. That program is called Summer Literary Seminars. It actually wrapped this summer after, I would have to look, I think it was 21 or 23 years. But I taught with them in St. Petersburg, Russia, and in Vilnius, Lithuania, and in Montreal, and in Tbilisi. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful program. It brought together English-speaking students from all over the world.
Mm-hmm. And most of these are either former Soviet republics or Russia itself. Do you have a background in the literature, or is there anything that tied you into those locations, or is it just the program?
I love Russian literature, but Mikhail Yassel, who was the founder of the program, was originally from St. Petersburg, and that was his interest, was bringing students to that part of the world and that culture. Mm-hmm. And so there are always also Russian-speaking authors who come to speak, and there's literature and translation, and there's literature that you would hear in the original Russian or the original Lithuanian or Georgian, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. Do you have any other languages, or are you as ugly American as I am and just have English?
Yeah, I'm pretty bad. I can flail around really pathetically in Russian and get myself lost. And, this is probably the same with French. I can spend money in French.
Nice. I can transliterate all these languages, but I can't figure out anything. That's basically as far as I've gone with this stuff. What brought you into writing? What brought you into teaching? Besides the making a living aspect of it. But,
no, I was an editor for many lifetimes and dog years. And periodically I started getting asked to teach and realized I really like teaching a lot.
Mm-hmm. How does editing feed into writing and vice versa? How did your editing background, I guess, affect the way you write? Or is it something that's too interwoven to kind of break apart?
Yeah, I was an editor before I was a writer. I think it gives you a tremendous respect for precision. Mm-hmm. So it's just that kind of awareness of precision of language, precision of fact-checking. Again, as a magazine editor, you cannot say anything unless you can prove it twice. Or it used to be that. We used to really all have fact-checkers on staff. So it was that. I think in a way it demystifies some of it as...
there's some original writing.
Yeah, well, there is some there's a little magic to composition. There is a little magic to writing, but a lot of it is just plain hard work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recorded with Bob Weil a couple of years ago at Live Right Press, and it turned out he edited one of my favorite books, a collection of essays by Clive James called Cultural Amnesia. And he said to me, Gil, if you had any idea what that looked like at the beginning, trust me, we managed to figure out how to structure it and make the whole thing work, but when it started, it was just this raw prose showing up, and can we do something with this? So, the idea that editing is a critical part of this is...
Oh, it is. And sometimes I've just kind of kept bad drafts of earlier things hanging around as sort of a reminder of like, okay, well, this was a mess also, but it eventually worked out.
Is this book your proudest of? No, I shouldn't ask. That's just like the kids thing.
It is. I was just about to say that's like asking which kid do you like more.
I'll ask that next.
It was the hardest. It was the hardest thing I've ever done professionally, and that doesn't mean any of the others were easy. But this was really difficult for a number of reasons, not the least of them that Cooney was just so elusive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how many years research and then writing did you...
It became wrapped up in the end. So it was 4 years from contract to publication, which isn't really that bad at all, but it felt like it at the time.
Was it almost a full-time job in that respect, or were you juggling?
I mean, we kind of felt like Dr. Cooney had just moved in here.
That's always my question with nonfiction writers, especially who've had long year projects. Yeah. Is there a point that the spouse is just like, dude, could you just stop talking about subject X at the dinner table?
Yeah, sometimes I really had to stop talking about Dr. Cooney because anything I would discover, I would find this so interesting. And you have to realize that other people may not be as obsessed as you are.
Yeah, or they just need it in smaller doses over time. You mentioned the Russian literature thing. Tolstoy or Dostoevsky?
Tolstoy.
Okay. War or Anna?
War.
Okay. Haji Murat?
No.
No? Okay. I think it's a guy thing. I think Haji Murat may be more of a male read for some reason.
Yeah. No, War and Peace.
Okay. Because that's my brother is always focused on the Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Bleak House versus Middlemarch. That's his other one if you have an English literature side. But I figure for the Russians, that's Chekhov fit in in the hierarchy, or would you still split as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky?
No, I'd say Tolstoy, Dostoevsky if we're playing that game.
Just making sure.
Okay.
Tell me about your writing upbringing. How you became a writer.
My writing upbringing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just always wanted to do it.
Well, so did I, but I quit, early on and realized I was a failure. You stuck with it and made a career.
That's the thing. Like, I am persistent. That's like, as I was saying with this book, I just, I couldn't let go of it. Yeah. I did not have a traditional trajectory. I don't have an MFA, for one thing.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, I don't know. But, and I was, like I say, I was a magazine editor for a long time and wrote for magazines, so that kept me writing as well. But I needed it. That's the only way I can explain it.
Yeah. Were you the kid who was writing novels at like 6 years old, just writing and writing?
I think I was always writing something, yeah.
Yeah. Who were the early sort of literary influences for you?
I always find that question just impossible because it's everything.
Yeah, but did you have stuff, though, as a kid that kind of, started that process? We all had the young adult era in our lives before, falling into War and Peace and everything.
Well, I never really read young adult novels. It wasn't much of a thing when we were growing up, and I think that is a good thing. And so War and Peace, I first discovered War and Peace in my school library. It was an abridged version when I was 13. I actually did not know that the author of this book was Leo Tolstoy because the cover was damaged. So I wasn't really aware that this was a great work of literature or anything like that. It was just big, and it promised to kind of take me elsewhere. And so that was like my first, that was...
Really?
That was mind-blowing. Yeah. That was just mind-blowing right there,
And when did you get to reading the full-length version and realize everything that was missing from the abridged?
I think the abridged version did a pretty good job. And I'm trying to remember when I read the full length. It was probably at some point in college. Yeah.
I know Stefan Zweig had a thing about wanting to do abridged versions of classics and just knock out, all the extraneous stuff. But luckily, he didn't get around to mutilating anything.
Yeah. I mean, I've read it 4 times. The abridged version, now that I'm trying to think, but I'm sure it didn't have 100 pages about the Battle of Borodino. That wouldn't have been in there. But the abridged version was still at least 500 pages, at least.
How'd the book change for you over time?
I'm probably due to read it again, but every time I read it, I am just astonished that somebody could be that brilliant, that somebody could pull all these pieces together.
Do you find, though, yourself sympathizing with different characters with different readings? Do you remember anything? Only because I did the Iliad about 4 times over 20 years, and it was only this last time in my 40s that Achilles finally made some sense to me. I'd always kind of been dismissive of him previously, and I just wonder with Tolstoy whether you...
I'm still a Natasha person.
Yeah? Now tell me, though, does it come from Tolstoy, the short chapter vibe that you've got? Because that floored me when I opened the book.
It doesn't, but I write really short chapters in anything. My short stories are very, very short. Most of them are under 1,000 words, and some of them well under 1,000 words. And when I did a novel, that was everything I write is sort of that length. I don't know, that just feels like a length that is natural to me, and possibly it could come partly from my magazine background of getting rid of all the excess words because you had space limitations.
Mm-hmm. And subheads for all of these occasional breaks, so that kind of fits with the chapter titles.
I love titles. I just love doing titles. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, because when you see something like that and it's just short and there's numbers, it's not as imaginative.
I like doing titles.
Yeah. Okay, I'd spent almost 20 years editing trade magazines, business to business stuff as opposed to consumer. Where our writing test was get rid of the adjectives and, see what you can do with this press release when they're no longer the leading supplier of blah, blah, blah. But yeah. Did you find the book getting reviewed in magazines that you used to edit?
Somewhat, although the magazines that I used to edit are sadly dying.
Yeah, that's the perils of our time.
It was reviewed in Oprah.com. I think that's sort of the last one standing.
Yeah. You still see it on the newsstands. It's still
there.
Yeah. We'll say I had a Pierre. It's okay. We'll
Yeah.
The listeners won't mind that he's making his case. I guess sort of the last question I had. You mentioned, well, it's a quote from the book, that the love of imagined places fuels extraordinary creativity. Mm-hmm. How far back does that go for you? That sense of imagination, the sense of trying to find a place?
Oh, probably as long as I can remember being alive.
Yeah.
And during this book also, I just had this like, oh, it would be so wonderful to see it. I wish I could go back there and look at it. You just have this, like, if I could just go back for one day and have a look around, where it's very much, when you're writing about the past, you're writing about a country you can't visit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the scene where you have within the Coney Island Museum, the little model of the old.
Yes, it's not there anymore, but it was fantastic. And then you think about somebody who loves this enough to put that many hours into recreating it that way.
Yeah. But how was the reception of the book overall? So a ton of wonderful blurbs. Did you really see, I was really happy with it. Yeah.
And like I say, I felt like I wanted to bring this story to light. I really did. I felt kind of a responsibility to Dr. Cooney as well. Mm-hmm. I found myself also wondering what he would think of it. And who knows? He might not have liked having his cover blown, but I felt like he deserved credit for what he did.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever dream about him during the process?
I did not dream about him. Okay. No,
I just didn't know if you had one of those.
He didn't manage to get into my dreams, but I went and visited his grave, and there's nothing there that says he did anything. And there's other people where it's like there's markers next to the important people, and there's nothing there. But I was really very grateful for the reception that the book got. And as I say, it's coming out in paperback next month.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful memorial to a significant figure.
Yeah.
So, Dawn, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And that was Dawn Raffel. Go check out The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney from Blue Rider Press. Cooney is Couney. Just came out in paperback this week. Fascinating book about an absolutely incredible figure and a weird era and phenomenon in American history and in neonatology. You should also visit Dawn's website, dawnraffel.com, to find out more about her writing, teaching, her editorial business, and more. And that's DAWNRAFFEL.com. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Dawn, so, who you been reading, besides War and Peace? And if you want to hear her answer to that, and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The second quarter 2019 episode went live recently and features an hour of book recommendations and some fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessam. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, and I just got a new scanner coming in a week or so that'll enable me to scan those a lot more easily than I have been doing previously, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one at Dawn's home in Hoboken, New Jersey. That was $20 for parking, no tolls or anything else, so I got off kind of easy on this one. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janousek, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Krantz, Kevin Khatallah, Jack Les Camela, Stephen Adler, Barbara Nessam, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Demetri Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Amarna Vevey, and Garrett Zakhar for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.